In order to realistically examine what was going on, you really have to go back to Frau and Moon, 1929, the Fritz Lang movie. Because you had the Berlin Rocket Society, members of the Berlin Rocket Society, which included Van Braun and Billy Lay and Hermann Oberth, who were consultants on that film. Frau and Moon deals fairly realistically with what was thought to be the most reasonable way of getting us into space. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Fritz Lang's earlier film, Metropolis, was savaged by critics who felt that it was a little too pie in the sky. It lacked much scientific substance to it, and it was more alchemy than it was science. So he really wanted to make it look much more authentic. It's a remarkable little film. I mean, it's tedious to watch, but it does show the assembly of a multi-stage rocket in a vehicle assembly building. It provided such an accurate portrayal of what an interplanetary craft might be like that there had been a model built for use in the film. That model was confiscated under Hitler's regime, under the Nazis. And prints of the film were taken out of circulation, and many of them were destroyed. So there was real concern that their secret weapon of World War II, which was the V-2 rocket, would be revealed by the content of Frau und Mund. Frau und Mund is an important film in terms of understanding a realistic representation. Once we get to the moon, it's all quite ridiculous. They're walking around in their street clothes and they're breathing the lunar air because a number of people in the sciences believe that there were pockets of oxygen in the low-lying areas of the moon. The getting there was pretty well thought out. Those scientists were very much involved in rocketry, for the Third Reich and also later in the United States. So Van Braun became a major spokesman for NASA. That was really the beginning of the practical side of it. What we really need to think about when we make science fiction movies is that this is a forum for projecting the message that our science and our human activity has consequences. And that's what we really have to think about.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, fire!
A lot of the science fiction movies of the 50s were really about the Cold War more than anything else. Even the alien invasion films, they were very much like Americans fighting a superior technological force. And even extraterrestrials were insidious. They infiltrated. They could make themselves look like us. You look at movies like It Came from Outer Space and Invaders from Mars. By implanting little things in our necks, they could control our minds.
I alone knew that the beings it carried, formless, terrifying beings from outer space, planned to conquer the world. And so fiendishly, by entering into the bodies and minds of captured human beings.
The Red Scare, the fear of communism, the Cold War, those are the things that really powered many of the science fiction films of the 1950s. But there were films like Project Moonbase, like Destination Moon, and like Rocket Ship XM that aspired to give some sort of realistic understanding of what the dangers of interplanetary travel might be and what the potential benefits might be.
The Twin Tower, we're going backwards.
We land backwards. Turn the jet in the direction of our fall and use the firing as brakes.
In 1949, you had Bonestell collaborated on the book Conquest of Space. That was September of 1949. What that was really a compendium of Bonestell's space paintings, with his co-author basically writing the text and explaining how we would get from here to there. But it mapped out in very much the same way that the Collier's series did, what the next decade in space development would be. So the launching of satellites, the building of a toroidal space station, and the whole idea of the torus was to create artificial gravity through centrifugal motion, and then developing the craft that would get us from that space station to the moon. One of the first people to really write in depth about stuff like that was really Robert Heinlein. He realized that the ship that got us up into space wasn't necessarily the ship that would land us on the moon. A ship that would land on the moon would have to have some sort of landing legs. And you see it very clearly in Project Moonbase, which he had a very hands-on role in scripting and visualizing. Jacques Fresco actually designed the props for that film, and they're really quite ingenious. The lunar lander, give or take a few lumps and bumps, is very close to the lunar module that landed on the moon, and visualized mainly by artists and engineers with the aid of scientists providing the kind of guiding thought.
Gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? You'll all be seated. I'd like to show you a motion picture we had prepared for this meeting. We have one of Hollywood's best-known actors to play for you. All right, Sam.
Kurt Newman attempted to launch the rocket ship XM almost immediately after the end of the war. And a lot of that came from the promise of space that was held in the captured B-2 rocket. But Newman couldn't sell the project. And that remained so until George Powell announced that he was making this film to make a very realistic movie about going to the moon.
We are not the only ones who know that the moon can be reached. We are not the only ones who are planning to go there. The race is on, and we'd better win it, because there is absolutely no way to stop an attack from outer space. The first country that can use the moon for the launching of missiles will control the Earth.
All of a sudden, getting an enormous amount of publicity. Because interest in space travel was finding its way into the popular press. It's that 1949 article illustrated by Noel Sickles called Rocket to the Moon. In it, it pretty much maps out the launch of a multi-stage rocket and a mission to the moon. And it does so with high drama, but that's the configuration of the spaceship that they ultimately used in Rocket Ship XM. Once that was announced and the press associated with Destination Moon, Kurt Newman was able to fund Rocket Ship XM.
A few more details which might interest you. The cabin is pressurized and gyro-controlled, keeping us in a level position at all times. We carry radar for navigation, shortwave for communication, and most important, more than twice the amount of fuel we expect to use to keep well within the margin of safety.
One of the ludicrous things about Rocket Ship XM is they head off to the moon and whoops, they make a mistake and end up going to Mars, which of course, the moon is 250,000 miles away. Mars, at its closest to the Earth, is 34 million miles away. So a little disparity here in distance. But they managed to actually get to Mars, and they find that Mars is inhabited by troglodytes who have blown themselves back to the Stone Age through nuclear war. So a little bit of a message film, but all of the Martian scenes, all the scenes that take place on Mars were tinted red. Rocket Ship XM was the first science fiction movie I ever saw. I was 4 years old. I barely knew what an airplane was, let alone a rocket ship, but I was hugely impressed by that film.
Atomic age to Stone Age. Bill!
There's a very interesting kind of rake lighting in that film, shot in the early hours of the morning with long shadows and very high contrast. With those red tinted scenes, it really seemed utterly otherworldly. So that was really the first film about interplanetary travel of the 50s to actually make it into theaters. And of course, Destination Moon just hit it out of the ballpark.
Ready to put on the helmets?
I won't be able to breathe in here.
You won't be able to breathe without it. Hook up your air hose.
Forget there's no air outside.
There's plenty of room for it.
Well, George Powell, when he made Destination Moon, he was asked about having made a science fiction movie. And he said, it's not really a science fiction movie, it's a documentary of the future. So his intent was to create a straightforward linear story that would deal with the challenges and the dangers of interplanetary travel, right? We get to the moon, where we weigh too much to get back, so we have to cannibalize our ship. Meanwhile, we do an EVA, there's an antenna that's got a shot of grease on it that freezes in the vacuum of space, and we have to go out into space, and one of the men gets dislodged from the surface of the ship, and he has to be retrieved. So dealing with the logistical issues and the dangers of interplanetary travel, that was really at the heart of what George Pal was attempting to do. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that the book, The Conquest of Space, came out, was beginning to have an impact on the popular culture, and people were starting to think about interplanetary travel. And there were a series of articles, in addition to of which the Collier series was part of. This idea that we were vulnerable really came from a better understanding of where we were in terms of the universe. You know, before the 20th century, we didn't understand the concept of island galaxies. And the fact that we're part of a grouping of stars and we're on the thin end and on the relatively new end of the galaxy, that was quite a revelation. But also understanding the dangers of space, asteroids, zooming through space that could collide with Earth and so forth. You know, the fear about Halley's Comet early in the 20th century, that the Earth would pass through the tail of Halley's Comet and this noxious gas would wipe out life as we know it. So there were always fears that there might be forces greater than humankind that we needed to be conscious of, and that we would need to deal with. And some of that resulted in people like Robert Heinlein, for instance, writing about generation ships, where we would create these city-sized spaceships, launch them into space, and generations of human beings would begin the immense interplanetary voyage from Earth to another Earth-like star, Earth-like planet out there, surrounding some star outside of our galaxy. All of those existed in the literature of science fiction during the era of the pulp magazines, roughly from the beginning of the 20th century until about 1955, when the pulp magazines became extinct.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
But originally, Bonestell had designed the ship that was eventually used for Flight to Mars, and then it was reused in It the Terror from Beyond Space and a host of other space films and on television. You know, it became the stock footage of 50s science fiction.
We have been expecting you.
Expecting? You speak English?
For many years, we have picked up your radio broadcasts and deciphered them. Many of us have even learned to speak some of your languages. I am Ikron, president of our council which rules this planet.
We are happy to meet you.
And let's face it, stories revolve around conflict. Nobody writes stories where nothing happens. Maybe they do it on Seinfeld, but not in the real world. So it's always things going wrong. It's either an act of nature or an act of human sabotage or something. There's always some sort of conflict that propels our adventures. But this idea that we might have to leave Earth, and we might have to leave it sooner than we imagined, that's been knocking around for a long, long period of time. Mars is a bit too far, and Mars would need to be terraformed. And the whole idea of terraforming, which really evolved in the 60s, where we basically changed the environment of a planet, you know, that became a viable thought for a period of time.
We understand so very little, really. If space is limitless and endless, then don't you see, the opposite must be true too. Smallness never ends either, but continues being tinier and tinier, just as the enormity of the universe becomes more and more enormous.
The purpose of science fiction is not to be predictive. It's to entertain. It's a literature of entertainment. But it's also a literature of ideas. It asks the big questions. What if? What if we found the secret to immortality? What do we do with an overpopulated world? How do we feed them? So all of these things really started to percolate in the 1950s, but because budgets were limited, science fiction stories that were optioned for film tended to be fairly earthbound and really dealt metaphorically with what was going on in the Cold War.